and I belong to two organizations, World Sindhi Congress and Sindhi Association of North America, and the third, our co-sponsor organization, Friends of South Asia. We are all delighted for you to attend this very, very important, I think it's going to be very good event today. So the story starts this way. I will probably put my personal splash to it. It was about January 2009. After finishing the gorgeous tour of Rajasthan and Delhi and India, I was 4 or 5 hours away from Bombay airport to take the flight back to California. And I had 4 hours to kill, and obviously what else we do in capital's world, and end up being in the mall. So, but the good thing out of that experience was that I just suddenly saw this book, Empires of Indus. I said, okay, wow, so it's fascinating. How come we don't have those books in America, or even for that matter in other airports I saw? So apparently it was newly published at that time. Is that true, I suppose, January 2009?
Yes, just come out in India. Yeah.
Right, so, I guess I caught it at the right time, and I just picked it, and by the time I was in California, I was 75% done with that book. And just fell in love with it. It was just gorgeous story. Interestingly, they classify it as a history book. Did you notice that? And because it's just not history, it's so much of like history, travel, documentary, I don't know, political, everything is in it, cultural, the ethnography. So anyway, without much ado, and I guess we have already know about Alice. Alice is from England, and she went to Cambridge and SOAS, is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then finally, we also had opportunity, I personally had opportunity, I think some of us, Dino and a couple of other people, to listen to her in London, twice actually, once in Manchester and once in London. Both of them were very good, successful, as good events as this, or even in London there were like more than 100, 150 people came. And there was a pin drop silence in the hall when she was reading the book, which is very uncharacteristic of a Sindhi evening. So I attribute this to her, or magic of her words rather. But anyway, and I would like to just invite maybe Rehman Soomro to say welcome from Sindhi Association of North America, and then after that Anu to introduce. Just say welcome from your organization, that's it.
Good evening. My name is Rehman Soomro, and I'm here from Sindhi Association of North America. Our association is 26 years old. Every year we celebrate a convention, different parts of the United States and Canada as North America. So this year on the 4th of July, we are having a convention at Houston, Texas. Last year we were in St. Louis, so we just rotate cities. And in 1999, we had a convention in San Francisco. Hopefully, maybe next year, we have again San Francisco. So everybody's welcome there. And thank you, and good to meet you.
Thank you. In a land where it seldom rains, and shout if you can't hear at the back. A river is as precious as gold. Water is potent. It trickles through human dreams, permeates lives, dictates agriculture, religion, and warfare. Ever since Homo sapiens first migrated out of Africa, the Indus has drawn thirsty conquerors to its banks. Some of the world's first cities were built here. India's earliest Sanskrit literature was written about the river. Islam's holy preachers wandered beside these waters. Pakistan is only the most recent of the Indus Valley's political avatars. I remember the first time I wanted to see the Indus, as distinctly as if a match had been struck in a darkened room. I was 23 years old, sitting in the heat of my rooftop flat in Delhi, reading the Rig Veda and feeling the perspiration running down my back. It was April 2000, almost a year since the war between Pakistan and India over Kargil in Kashmir had ended, and the newspapers which the delivery man threw onto my terrace every morning still portrayed neighbouring Pakistan as a rogue state, governed by military cowboys, inhabited by murderous fundamentalists. The rhetoric had the patina of hysteria. But what was the troubled nation next door really like? As I scanned the 3,000-year-old hymns, half listening to the call to prayer which drifted over the rooftops from the nearby mosque, to the medley of other azans, all slightly out of sync, I read of the river praised by Sanskrit priests. The Indus they called unconquered Sindhu, river of rivers. Hinduism's motherland was not in India, but in Pakistan, its demonized neighbor. At the time, I was studying Indian history eclectically, omnivorously, and hastily during bus journeys to work, at weekends, lying under the ceiling fan at night. Even so, it seemed that everywhere I turned, the Indus was present. Its merchants traded with Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. A Persian emperor mapped it in the 6th century BC. The Buddha lived beside it during previous incarnations. Greek kings and Afghan sultans waded across it with their armies. The founder of Sikhism was enlightened while bathing in a tributary. And the British invaded it by gunboat, colonized it for 100 years, and then severed it from India. The Indus was part of Indians' lives until 1947. The very name of India comes from the river. The ancient Sanskrit speakers called the Indus Sindhu. The Persians changed the name to Hindu, and the Greeks dropped the H altogether. Chinese whispers created the Indus and its cognates, India, Hindu, Indies. From the time that Alexander the Great's historians wrote about the Indus Valley, spinning exotic tales of indomitable Indica, India and its river tantalized the Western imagination. Hundreds of years later, when India was divided, it might have been logical for the new Muslim state in the Indus Valley to take the name India, or even Hindustan, as the valley was called by an 18th century English sailor. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah rejected the colonial appellation and chose the pious neologism Pakistan, land of the pure, instead. He assumed that his coevals in Delhi would do the same, calling their country by the ancient Sanskrit name, Bharat. When they did not, Jinnah was reported to be furious. He felt that by continuing to use the British name, India had appropriated the past. Pakistan, by contrast, looked as if it had been sliced off and thrown out. During the 2 years that I lived in Delhi, I wondered about these things, the ironies, misnomers, and reverberations of history. But perhaps, to my sun-baked imagination, it was the river itself that was most enticing. I dreamt about that river, which begins in Tibet and ends near Karachi in the shimmer of the Arabian Sea. I tried to picture those waters, which emperors had built forts beside, which poets still sang of, the turbulent, gold-bearing abode of snake goddesses. When at last I reached Pakistan, it was to map these layers of history and their impress on modern society. During the past 60 years, Pakistanis have been brutalized by the violence of military dictatorships, enraged or deceived by the state's manipulation of religion, and are now being terrorized by the West's war on terror. But Pakistan is more than the sum of its generals and jihadis. The Indus Valley has a continuous history of political, religious, and literary ferment, stretching back thousands of years. A history which Pakistanis share with Tibetans and Indians. The intertwining of these chronicles, memories, and myths, that is the inheritance of the people who live in the Indus Valley. This book recounts a journey along the Indus, upstream and back in time, from the sea to the source, from the moment that Pakistan first came into being in Karachi to the time, millions of years ago in Tibet, when the river itself was born. Along the way, the river has had more names than its people have had dictators. In Sindh, it is called Purali, meaning capricious, an apt description of a river which wanders freely across the land, creating cities and destroying them. Sindhis also know it as Samunda, ocean, a name evocative of the vastness of the river within their landscape and civilization. For Pashtuns on the frontier with Afghanistan, the Indus is simultaneously Nilab, blue water, Sher Darya, the Lion River, and Abbasin, father of rivers. Along the river's upper reaches, these names are repeated by people speaking different languages and practicing different religions. Baltis once called the Indus Gemtso, the Great Flood, or Tsufo, the Male River. Here, as in Ladakh and Tibet, it is known as Senge Sampo, the Lion River. Today, in spite of the militarized borders that divide the river's people from each other, the ancient interconnectedness of the Indus still prevails. The river gave logic to my explorations, and it lies at the heart of this book because it runs through the lives of its people like a charm. From the deserts of Sind to the mountains of Tibet, the Indus is worshipped by peasants and honoured by poets. More than priests or politicians, it is the Indus they revere. And yet, it is a diminished river. The mighty Indus of Sanskrit hymns and colonial tracts was heavily damned during the 20th century, beginning with Britain's profit-driven colonisation of the lower Indus Valley and extending through 60 years of army-dominated rule in Pakistan. Big dams have shackled the river, transforming the lives of human and non-human species on its banks and in its waters. Now, when I think of the Indus, I remember the eulogies of Sanskrit priests, Greek soldiers, and Sufi saints. Their words come down to us across the centuries, warning of all there is to lose. So that's the story of how I began writing the book. And what I'm going to do now is just take you on a very quick photographic tour of the book and of the river. Can you all hear me clearly? Yeah? Yes?
Before you do this, can you introduce yourself, how you got involved into these things?
Yes, sure. So my name's Alice, and I was living in Delhi when I got the idea to write the book. I'd moved there. I was working for a literary magazine and for a newspaper, and for I was working as an editor and as a journalist. And really, at the time that I was in India, as I was explaining in the preface, Pakistan seemed like a very, very far away place. It was as if there was a big wall dividing the two countries from each other. And yet, the more I read of history, and the more I read of literature, and the more I read of culture and religion, it seemed to me that the countries had so much which was the same. And not only that, they had this river, the Indus, which is really, as I was explaining, was once completely at the heart of Hindu civilization. And so there was this big irony that there I was sitting in Delhi, reading about the history of the Indus, and the Indus was almost completely cut off from the people in India. India and Pakistan seemed like they could have been 1,000 miles away from each other. And so, so with the idea of this river in my head, this river I'd never seen, I went back to London and I did an MA in South Asian history at SOAS, and I began to study the history of the river. And I read and read and read and wrote and wrote and wrote, and I finished my MA and I submitted my dissertation about the river. And then finally, in 2003, I went to the Indus for the first time. I flew to Karachi, and then I drove out along the road with a friend and saw the Indus. And people began to say to me, before I even arrived at the river, "What Indus? Where is this mighty Indus?" And so in my head, I had all these images of this river described down through the centuries, this mighty, huge, all-dominating river. And it was when I actually arrived at the banks of the Indus that the book stopped being a history book, and it really became a book of the environment and travel and modern culture. It became a travel book with this ecological concern of the river itself at its centre.
So your journey was from south to north?
It was from Karachi, yes, from the Arabian Sea all the way up to Tibet.
So which part did you see the first time after this?
Tata? Yes, near Tata, exactly, yeah. Just over the bridge from there.
Yeah, okay.
I went out on a boat.
How would you compare it with Ganges? Did you see that?
I saw the Ganges. I mean, it's the two rivers are so important to Sanskrit civilization, and the Ganges has different, ecologically has different problems. So the Ganges is incredibly polluted nowadays. The Indus isn't polluted because they built these left and right bank outfall drains which take away all the industrial effluents and the sewage. So none of that goes into the Indus. But the problem of the Indus is that so much water is drawn out of the Indus for irrigation in the Punjab and Upper Sindh that down in the Delta and in Lower Sindh there's huge problems of lack of water from the fact that the river has been sucked out dry.
Does the book talk about the special species of dolphins which are...
Yes, it does. Should we take questions now?
Well, I think, yeah, that's what she was suggesting. Go ahead and do your presentation and then maybe take the Q&A.
Okay.
It's a very... Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So the first chapter of my book, there's 12 chapters of the book, and I go, as I was explaining, I go from the mouth of the river on the Arabian Sea, upstream and gradually back in time. So this picture is a Hindu man in Karachi, and he's a Hindu sweeper, and these people are still known as bungis in Karachi. And of course my book is about water, so water is at the centre of my book. And chapter 1 is about what happened to Karachi in 1947, when it suddenly became the capital city of Pakistan, because of course it was a capital city for the first decades of Pakistan's existence. So it's about what happened at that moment, that really pivotal moment in 1947, when Pakistan suddenly, overnight, Pakistan comes into being. I think it's different for India, because India was, as Jinnah this explains Jinnah's anger about the name. India remained almost where it was, whereas Pakistan was a new country and it had to start completely from scratch. And there was a sharing of the spoils, so the army was divided, all the infrastructure of the country was divided, but Pakistan really felt like it was beginning on its back foot. It really didn't get, it had to just completely come up with the country overnight. And so Karachi, from having been a kind of an important but slightly sleepy port town in British India, became the capital of this country. And what I was looking at in this chapter was the fate of these people, who were Hindu. So most Sindhi Hindus migrated in 1947 to India, but these people stayed behind. And you'll have to read the chapter to see what happens to them and the various issues surrounding it. But it was a kind of, it was what they seemed to represent and what had happened to them, the fate of these people in Pakistan. This picture I like to show. How many of you are from Pakistan originally? How many of you have been to Karachi? Okay, so you all know about Karachi Beach. This is really near where I lived. But I quite like to show this to English people because often they think of Pakistan as this incredibly dangerous place where everyone is running around and carrying guns, and the Pakistanis don't have any time for recreation or a stroll on the beach. So that's why this picture is here. And then I did a journey. Chapter 2 is about the Delta. So it's really about what happened when the British took over, when the British colonized Sindh in 1843. And they did a number of things. They were obsessed. They became obsessed with this river, the Indus, and they had absolutely no idea what a tricky and difficult river this was to manage. And for a long time after the colonization of Sindh, the Sindh was draining money from the British coffers, and they were having to increase the opium wars and the opium trade over on the other side of India. But what they finally did was they discovered irrigation. They discovered that they could make back the money they lost colonizing Sindh by irrigating. And so and many of the canals and the irrigation plans that are in place now in Sindh and in the Punjab date from that time. So of course the Saghir barrage, 1932. And what I did was I did this journey through the Delta, following in the footsteps of many other people. Alexander Burns, who's still remembered in the Delta, he was a British spy. Alexander the Great, and I wanted to see what had happened to the Delta. And I'm sure many of you know that the Delta has shrunk because the irrigation has taken so much water out of the river. The British themselves, the British engineers, they viewed all the sweet water running out to sea, they viewed it as a waste. They thought, we've got to grab all that sweet water and stop it. What's the point of it just going out to sea? And what they didn't realise was, of course, that the mangroves rely on this mixture of salt, sweet water, and that the people in the Delta rely on the water coming downstream, and the people in Lower Sindh rely on water coming downstream. And as a result, it's become very, very difficult in Lower Sindh in particular, and in the Delta, because of this lack of water. And this was a journey to find out what had happened to the people of the Delta. This is a man what I found out was that I could actually walk right across the Indus. This mighty Indus, which almost completely ruined Alexander the Great's whole campaign, is now such a trickle in its southern reaches that this man is standing in the Indus. And this man is driving his bullock cart across the Indus. And as you can see, there's not really very much water. Chapter 3 was about the Shiddi people. So these are the descendants of African slaves brought from East Africa during the Islamic and later the global British Western slave trade. And these Shiddi people were brought as slaves, but in 1843 the British, to justify the colonization of Sindh, freed all the slaves. And suddenly these people were no longer slaves, but free men and women. And this chapter was about a meeting with a Shiddi family, who I think are here. The man in the center, who's since passed away, this was a picture taken in Hyderabad, Sindh. He is the son of a writer called Musafir, who took the name Musafir to show that he had come from very far away, that he was a traveller. Musafir's father, so this man's grandfather, was a slave. There you have the history of slavery in this one family. And Musafir wrote this incredibly important book about the Shiddis in Pakistan, which he published in 1952. And my quest in this chapter was to discover his family, to get the book translated, and to find out really more about Shiddi culture. So just these are some pictures of Shiddis that I met in Badin, and in Tandobago, and in Hyderabad, and other places. And of course, as you know, Sindh is famous for its Sufi shrines. And many of these shrines are along the banks of the Indus. So this is Bitshah. And what really interested me in this particular portion of my journey was the fact that this land, Sindh, is in effect, because it was the earliest part of India which had Muslim visitors. So whether they were traders or missionaries or kind of holy men or soldiers, Sindh has historically had the earliest contact between Hinduism and Islam. And in Sindh, even today, you see this incredibly rich and sympathetic kind of mingling of these two religions, which today seems almost impossible because one thinks of Hinduism and one thinks of Islam as so totally separate. But in Sindh, you see how these two faiths and these two peoples really did come together over centuries and centuries and centuries. You know, the first Muslims got to Sindh in 711, so it's centuries and centuries and centuries of cohabitation and access to each other. And in these Sufi shrines, you really see these are places of freedom for local Pakistani people, for women especially. These are the legs of some Pakistani women who come here to get away from their lives and to get away from their families and to have some freedom. And these are really amazing spaces in Pakistan. Places of self-expression and really where bigotry doesn't seem to exist very much. So here are some visitors to shrine in Upper Sindh. And these were some really beautiful tombs. This was a picture taken in some tombs near Johi in Sindh. And this is the story of Soni swimming across the river. I love this picture because there she is with her pot. You all know the story of Soni, who wanted to go and meet her lover across the river, and she was married off to the man with the prayer beads, and every night she would swim across the river. And then one night her sister-in-law saw what she was doing and was so appalled that she substituted Soni's baked clay pot for an unbaked one, and Soni gets into the middle of the river, and the pot comes apart, and there's the wonderful passage in the Risalo of Shah Abdul Latif where he describes the crocodiles and the fish attacking Soni as she tries to reach her lover on the other side. Again, this is a gathering at it's gone out of my mind. Where is this? It's the Horse of Shiet. Shiet. So this chapter begins with Shiet. And my whole journey was really a kind of link, a little chain of acquaintance of people taking me from one place to another. So the Shidi friends that I made in chapter 3 then wanted me to go and see the shrine of Shiet, who was this proto-socialist from the 18th century who was beheaded by the Mughals for being pro-peasants, pro-poor, and perceived as being anti-landlord. And there's a very curious modern situation in this shrine, which you'll have to read chapter 4 to find out. This is a gathering. This is the Horse of Shiet. Again, this is at Sewan Sharif. And here you have a man who, if I had taken this picture in India, I might have thought that he was a Hindu because he's got these cobras which are very much like something associated with Lord Shiva. And indeed, this center, the Sufi center at Sewan Sharif, is believed to have been based on a Shaivic center, and it used to be called, and there is a connection between Shiva and Sewan, the Kalanda, who was also said to have controlled the river and to have been the lord of the river of the Indus and controlled its flow. So there you see a meeting of Hinduism and Islam in this shrine. Another really fascinating place I visited was Saghir, and this is a Hindu tableau outside a temple at Sadubela, and this is a vision of hell. So there's all sorts of, you can't really see in this picture, but there's all sorts of terrible things happening to these people. And this was a Hindu island in the middle of the river Indus, and upstream was the shrine of a really, really interesting figure who is in this picture, but I'll just come back to this picture. It's Zindapir, or Udaralal. And this is one of these classic figures. So for the Hindus, Zindapir and Udaralal is a Hindu god, and for the Muslims, he's a very, very holy person. He's Khwaja Khizr. And here he is in this manuscript. And this is a really lovely picture because it shows Khwaja Khizr, who's just discovered the source, the spring of eternal life. And there is Alexander the Great peering over the rock, trying to find the spring. But he didn't manage to find it. So Alexander the Great luckily died a normal death, a normal human death. And Khwaja Khizr lives on and comes to visit this shrine in the middle of the Indus at Saghir. And here are some people, the Mahanas, who are living in the Indus, still living in the Indus in Pakistan, on their boats. Chapter 5 is about the Punjab. And this is a woman, this is an Indian woman, who's on a pilgrim visa to Pakistan. And she's at the birthplace of Guru Nanak. And she's collecting dust. She's pulled back the carpet in the hallway, and she's collecting dust into a little paper packet. And I said to her, "Why are you collecting the dust?" And she said, "This place is so holy that I'm going to collect this dust and I'm going to take it back to India." And then she picked some up like this and she put it in her tongue.
Wow.
Yeah. Such holy, even the dust is holy. And of course, much of what is now in the Punjab is full of holy places of Sikhs. And every year these Sikhs come from India to Pakistan on these very, very highly controlled tours of the holy places of Sikhism. And this is a beautiful frescoed ceiling at the birthplace of Guru Nanak in Pakistan. And here is Guru Nanak bathing in a river. He was enlightened while he was bathing. And so here you see a really classic Indus Valley religion where water is at the center of the rituals of Sikhism. There are many, many stories about Guru Nanak to do with water, with him creating streams and stopping streams and producing water out of the desert. And this is one such illustration of him. And this, of course, is the Golden Temple at Amritsar in India, where a man is, you can see the man on the right hand side, who's doing very much the same thing as Guru Nanak, purifying himself with this water. And this is the first bus ride, the first bus I got on. I crossed from Pakistan into India, and I got on a bus, and I'd spent months and months in Pakistan, where every time I got on a bus, I would always go to the front of the bus, because of course that was the ladies section. And I tried to go to the front of this bus. Of course there was no ladies section, because it was India, different in India. And so I sat at the back on the right and took this picture, this man in his nice turban. And this, again, this is back in Lahore. So this is Ranjit Singh, who was a great Sikh Maharaja, who kept the British at bay throughout the early 19th century. And this, his resting place is right next to, is sandwiched between the Lahore fort and the beautiful, beautiful mosque of Emperor Aurangzeb, the Badshahi Mosque. And this is a French infantry manual, which Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he brought these generals from France to train his army. And this is a Persian translation of that infantry manual. Chapter 6, going further back in time, was about this very important moment when I said that the first, so at least the first recorded visit of a Muslim to India was in 711, when Muslims were sent by the Caliph to, a Muslim army was sent to explore Sindh, and they marched up Sindh, marched through Sindh, but they were told to compromise. They were told, they had orders to compromise, not to fight the Hindus, not to kill the Hindus, but to view the Hindus, who had a holy book, the Rig Veda, and the other Vedas, to view the Hindus as people of the book, and therefore not to try and convert them, but to treat them as the dhimmi, as the protected. And what happens with the birth of this man, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, so this is Ghazni in Afghanistan, is that this Sultan views Hindus no longer as the protected, and Shias definitely not as the protected. He's an iconoclast, and he goes in both directions from this town, Ghazni in Afghanistan. He fights Shias in one place, and then during the summer, he crosses into India, and he pillages temples, and he creates political jihad. He really does create this concept of jihad as war against the non-believers. This is skipping ahead slightly. So here he is, kissing the foot of his slave, Ayaz. So this picture ties in quite nicely with the story I was telling you earlier about the Shibis. There you have a black man who's the slave of the Sultan. And what happens when Sultan Mahmud crosses the Indus and raids into India is that it sets a pattern for everybody else. You then have a very different kind of engagement between Muslims coming into India and the Hindus already in India. And centuries and centuries of war follow. This is modern day Afghanistan, and these are the Kochi people. And I'm just going to flick back to this picture from the Akbarnama. This is Emperor Akbar, who himself, of course, his ancestors came from outside India, defeated the ruling Pashtun king, and installed themselves on the throne of India. And then they had to fortify the empire. So what they did was they built this big, beautiful red sandstone fort on the banks of the Indus. And this is Emperor Akbar giving thanks for a military victory on the banks of the Indus. And that fort is still there, of course, and you can go there. And it's now used by the Pakistan Army. And they held Zardari there, and they held Nawaz Sharif there. They were all incarcerated in this fort.
Oh, Attack.
At Attack, exactly. Where the two rivers come together. The river from Kabul and the Indus, the blue and the brown river. And these are Afghan refugees in NWFP in Pakistan, in a school for girls. And this is Shah Rukh Khan in Peshawar on the back of a rickshaw. Pakistanis, of course, love Bollywood. And this is Samiul Haq. This I went to his, he runs at Akura Kathak, he runs a big madrasa, and of course he trained many of the Taliban. He's a very friendly man, and this was taken at his hujra, he had this picture hanging up, so of course he's holding a gun in one hand and the Quran in the other. I spent a lot of time in Swat, in the valley of Swat, and this, as you all know, says, Ao Sanam, Swat Chile, come lover, let's go to Swat. And it was this very, very beautiful river valley, much like the Indus Valley in microcosm. So you have mountains and rushing streams and greenery and very, very lovely place. And it was known as the Switzerland of Pakistan before it was taken over by Mullah Fazlullah, by the Taliban. And what it also was, it became the third holy land of Buddhism. So from about 300 BC to 300 AD, this place, which was on the Silk Route, right on the Silk Route, suddenly became an incredibly important holy land for Buddhists. So the original Buddhist holy land was Eastern India, and then really the second Buddhist holy land is Sri Lanka, and the third Buddhist holy land is the Swat Valley, Gandhara. Taxila, this is a little girl in Swat. This is one of the biggest monasteries in the Swat Valley, or just below the Swat Valley, Takti Bahi, which is, these are beautifully preserved meditation cells. And this beautiful statue. So because the road runs along the river in Swat, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Buddhist statues. Most of them have been defaced because local people or Taliban consider them to be icons and therefore blasphemous. But this statue, which was 7 meters high, was intact. In 2005 and 6, when I visited the valley, it was intact. And nobody had touched it, and it had stood there since about the time of the Prophet of Islam. So all that time it had stood there, nobody had ruined it. And then in 2007, when the Taliban took over the valley, first thing they did was to dynamite this beautiful statue. It was really, really sad, because there had been this very perfect coexistence until that moment of these two faiths and these two cultures. Of course, they were doing what had been done in Bamiyan. This is Bamiyan in Afghanistan, which was also an incredibly important point on the Silk Route. And these statues, of course, were destroyed. Then chapter 8 of my book was about Alexander the Great. And he, of course, marched across the world. He arrived in the Indus Valley, and everything went wrong for him in the Indus Valley. Firstly, he tried to fight the hill tribes of northern Pakistan, and he'd been used to having these big battles where kings came together with their army, and somebody won and somebody lost, and then there was a treaty and there were terms and goods were exchanged. And the people he met in the northern Indus Valley didn't behave like that at all. They attacked at night, they had guerrilla tactics, they ran away, and Alexander the Great had to split his army in two, and one part of his army marched to the Indus, and then he led the other part north to this beautiful place called Pirsa, or Aeonus as the Greeks knew it, where he had a last big battle, and he built a fort, and he defeated the tribes, he thought, and then he marched down the river, and about a month later everybody came back and established themselves again. But Alexander became a hero in the West, and here he is in a medieval manuscript. You can see him talking to the naked Brahmins of the Indus Valley. And he also became a hero in the East. He became a hero for Muslims in Persia. He became, having been a pagan king, which is what he was, he became a Muslim warrior. So amazing things were achieved in the name of Alexander the Great. This is his men, also in a European manuscript, this is his men being eaten by crocodiles in the Indus Valley. And you can see that his myth lives on in the Indus Valley, because this is a journey right on this rock. I was taken to see it by my hosts, these two men. This is on the banks of the Indus in the Kala Daka, in the Black Mountains, and this is Alexander the Great's 6-foot-high handprint. And they're showing this to me. So you can see that he really is a living presence. And here I was on a journey to the Nawa Pass, which is between Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is where Alexander crossed through. And I had this very crazy journey, which you can read about in the book. And this is Hund. So this is the banks of the Indus at Hund, which is where Alexander crossed from one side of the Indus to the other. And these are people I met. I walked for 3 weeks in the footsteps of Alexander, from Hund northwards to Pearsall, where he had this last battle. And it was a really, really wonderful and beautiful journey with many mishaps along the way. This is a man who used to be a poppy farmer, and he's feeling very cross because USAID came and destroyed his poppy fields in the 1980s, and then they refused to give him any further money. He imagined he was going to get lots of funding, and he's really, really cross because he's in the settled areas and he's not allowed to grow poppy, and his neighbours 3 miles away in the tribal area of Kaladaka are all growing poppy, and it's selling for something like 50 times what you get for onions and carrots in the market. And so he's got this tumble-down house, and they've all got these huge pink and green palaces on the banks of the Indus, and they've got loads of weapons. So he was really upset. And this is just when we were going, this was in Kaladaka, this is in the Black Mountains. And this is the people who walked with me. And this is my host, as you can see, carrying his gun, as everybody does. And this is Pearsall. So this is where Alexander the Great, this amazing hill, which is described by Alexander the Great's historians. They describe the rock encircled by the Indus. And this is, I climbed up here with my friend Aslam Khan, and we stayed the night in this hut. And these were our hosts, who were shepherds. And this is their family, all the grandchildren. And again, it's really a beautiful place, and you could see all the mountain ranges in the distance, and it really did feel like being in heaven. There it is again. These are the Kalash people. So going further back in time, further north in Pakistan, so we're now in Chitral. This is the Kalash villages. And one of the really curious things about my journey was that when I was in India, those 2 years I spent in India, the BJP was in power. Saying crazy things. And one of the things that the BJP got really, really worked up about was the so-called Aryan Migration into India in something like 1200 BC. So we're talking about a very, very long time ago. The BJP hated the notion that the Aryans who created Vedic culture and who created Sanskrit could have been thought by these so-called communist historians, these socialist historians, such as Romila Thapar, very, very recognized Indian historians, should have been thought to have been migrating into India. They wanted to prove that the Aryans were native, indigenous to India. So in India, this debate is incredibly fraught. But in Pakistan, where everybody who is, many, many Pakistanis were immigrants. Either they were Mahajers, or they trace their lineage to Persia or from the Prophet. So the concept of being an immigrant to Pakistan is not at all contentious. And in Pakistan, this theory of the Aryan Invasion was embraced by academia and by historians and by archaeologists. And they tried to prove that the Aryans did indeed migrate into the Indus Valley. And one of the supposed links are the Kalash people, who worship who have a religion that is very similar to early Vedic religion. And so possibly these are the cousins of the Aryans. And that was what my journey was about. And this part of Pakistan is really mind-blowingly beautiful. I don't know if any of you have been to the northern areas. Yeah, I really thought it was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Full of these ancient proofs of very ancient culture, including these stone circles, which nobody knows why they're there because the government won't give any permits to archaeologists to excavate in this part of Pakistan. So it's a mystery. But that's the man who owned the stone circle. This is the most beautiful stone circle. Really, really lovely. Just between two rivers. So it's clearly been put there by a people, an ancient people, who worship rivers, nature maybe. It's probably a burial ground for an ancient chief. But as I say, nobody knows why it's there or what its meaning is or even how old it is. And this was the thing that I loved most. This was a rock carving, which is completely unknown. It's high up in the Gilgit River Valley, and I was just completely amazed when I saw this. because to me it looks like, you can't really see it so well here, but it looks like a Matisse or a Picasso. I mean, it's really artistic, but it's a prehistoric carving of some archers, probably catching ibex, the mountain goat, which was considered sacred in very, very, very early times, Paleolithic times, and is still there's still a kind of reverence for the goat, for the ibex, with its curly horns. And these are archers doing what Pakistanis still do today, which is hunt this goat. The Gilgit Valley. This is the Indus at this place where there's many carvings, chilas, prehistoric carvings. So when you think of a river which runs through a desert and its lower reaches, and then runs through very, very difficult to navigate mountain ranges, when these mountains are all crossing each other, and the river becomes a way of going, either you float down the river or you have to come to the river to cross it. And where the river narrows, there you'll have a ferry established, you'll have people coming and going, and you have proof of this ancient meeting of peoples in the rock carvings of this area. So there's all sorts of, you can see that all sorts of people pass through for centuries and centuries and centuries. This is possibly a very, very early picture of a god, a river god is what archaeologists think. There's Buddhist carvings, many of these carvings, something like 90% of the carvings at Chilas are now threatened by being submerged beneath the waters of a dam that the government is building at Chilas. So 90% of these carvings will very, very soon be submerged. And this is on the line of control. So this is right between up where they were fighting, right up on the Pakistani side. This is an artillery line, which I took a picture of this because it reminded me of, it was like a modern day stone circle. So I'd just been taking pictures of stone circles, and this was like a modern version. And this is where the fighting happened during Kargil and afterwards. And some of the most beleaguered and really saddest people that I met in the Indus Valley were in the Delta, where they'd really been abandoned, and also here, where these people used to trade backwards and forwards across the river. They used to, until probably 1971, they were going into to meet their cousins in Ladakh on the Indian side, and now they've really been completely cut off. They can't go forward because they'll get shot by the Indian army or the Pakistani army, and now they've had to shift all their points of reference, and so they're now trading into Skardu, which is much further away, and they were really in a very, very difficult situation. This is a man gathering wheat. This is at Skardu, where there's a big fort. This is back again this is Harappa. So we're now going even further back in time. In 1921, 1922, a new civilization was discovered on the banks of the Indus. We all know Mohenjo-daro, Harappa. Till then, historians had thought that the earliest kind of culture that you could see with it, any form was the Vedic one. They were wrong. There were these incredible planned, sophisticated cities in 2600 BC on the banks of the Indus. A huge interconnected civilization stretching right from the Himalayas right the way down to the sea. They were trading with Mesopotamia. There's proof of that. Very, very, very organized cities. This is the modern day village of Harappa. And this is somewhere they were trading with. These people of the Indus Valley were trading with Kashmir, with this village in Kashmir on the banks of the Dal Lake. So while the people in the Indus Valley were in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were living in their houses with drainage and big baths and kind of credible civic organization, they were trading cedar. They were taking cedar and paying in carnelian beads and pottery. These people who were still living in these pit huts on the banks of the Dal Lake, and this is their menhirs. So there's the people who have a kind of ancient reverence for, obviously erected these big menhirs in the way that people did all over the world. And what I wanted to see, what I was interested in at this point, was seeing these very, very early carvings even older than the one I just showed you. This is in Kashmir, so this is on the way to walking up through this village to see this carving, which has just been discovered. And there's various theories about whether it's it's representing the stars or whether it's representing a river with the lakes, the famous lakes of Kashmir. Anyway, it's very, very old. And this is a giant. And you can see that he's got outstretched arms, big fingers. And there were carvings like this in Ladakh in India, and there were carvings as far south as Chilas in Pakistan. And this again is another ancient culture that we know very little about. But while most of the carvings are really, really small, this is a big, big giant with and there's a nice new picture that I took, which is in this American edition of the book. So I'd seen lots and lots of pictures of giants with their big, dynamic, vibrant pictures, and then I came across this carving on the banks of the Indus in Ladakh in India. And I find this very eerie and very spooky because it looks to me like somebody who's shrouded. And I had this very strange dream while I was traveling in Ladakh that in ancient times people were bound up in rope and they were placed on this carving, and then this is people who transgressed, so as a punishment, and then they were pushed into the river. But I don't know whether that's true or not, because it was a dream and nobody could ever tell me whether they thought it was. This is in India. So this is a people who kind of resemble, a little bit, they resemble the Kailash of Pakistan, but they're in India. This is on the border. This is as far as you can go in India, as far east as you can go. This is in Ladakh. And now we're entering Tibetan territory. So the river, of course, rises in Tibet. And the last journey I had to make was to the source of the Indus. And it was by far and away the most arduous. Afghanistan, the northern areas, nothing could compare to traveling to the source of the Indus in Tibet. It was very, very cold. Nobody wanted to come with me. The only person I could find was this incredibly drunken Nepali man who secreted lots and lots of brandy into his rucksack. But luckily, and these are we met a Drokpa nomad who showed us the way, and we eventually arrived. This is the encampment of the Drokpa, quite near the source of the Indus. And this is the source of the Indus, the source of this mighty river. And it's just bubbling up, very, very quietly bubbling up from the ground, and a kind of mossy bank. And there we are at the source of the river. So that's the end of the journey.